Hello and welcome. I'm Nate Clauser, a member of the steering committee of Our Revolution Somerville and a co-chair of ORS's electoral working group. I'm pleased to welcome the candidates, ORS members, and members of the public to this forum for the candidates seeking ORS's endorsement in their run for school committee this year in Somerville. This is the second of 4 municipal candidate forums ORS is hosting this week. These forums are being held on Zoom and are also being live streamed to the ORS YouTube channel, where they remain available for after the fact viewing. Since 2016, Our Revolution Somerville's mission has been to transform politics in Somerville and to advance a broad progressive agenda in the city. We invited candidates running for Somerville Mayor, City Council, and School Committee this year to apply for endorsement by completing our candidate questionnaire by June 7th. Questionnaire responses from all candidates who applied for endorsement can be found on our website at the link I'm dropping into the chat now. This forum is the next step in our endorsement process, where our members and the public have an opportunity to hear from the candidates about themselves and their campaigns. Then later this month, our members will vote on whether and which candidates to endorse in this year's municipal elections. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to this evening's moderator, Carlos Contreras, to explain the rules and kick things off. Carlos?
Thanks, Nate. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos Contreras. I'm a Somerville educator, a member of ORS's education working group, and your moderator for this evening's forum. So we'll begin in a moment with candidate opening statements. These statements and all of your question responses this evening will be limited to 90 seconds in length. To give you an idea of how much time you have left to speak, our timekeeper will hold up a green sheet of paper when you have 60 seconds left, a yellow sheet of paper when you have 30 seconds left, and a red sheet of paper when you have 5 seconds left. Then when your time expires, if you are still speaking, your audio will be muted and I will move on to the next candidate. All of the questions that will be asked tonight were prepared in advance by our Revolution Somerville's electoral and education working groups with input from the ORS members and coalition partner organizations. The candidates do not have advanced knowledge of the questions. We ask that the candidates be respectful of our rules, of the moderator, and of each other. Please only speak when called upon. Please do not attempt to interrupt one another or the moderator. And please do your best to stay within the 90-second time limit so that we can hear your entire response. ORS thanks the candidates for filling out our questionnaire and appreciates you all taking the time to join us this evening. With all of that out of the way, let's begin with the candidates' opening statements. For these statements, we'll proceed in alphabetical order by candidate's last name. For subsequent questions, we'll keep the same general order, but stagger which candidate goes first. So for opening statements, we'll start with Scott Benjamin. You have 90 seconds.
Hello, thank you, ORS, for hosting this and giving us a chance to talk. I am unmuted, right? You can hear me? I came to Somerville 28 years ago to work with kids in Mystic and North Street housing developments, and I stayed. I have a daughter in 2nd grade at West Somerville Neighborhood School. I'm a 20-year member of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. I've been teaching at Bunker Hill Community, one of the most diverse community colleges in the country, for over 20 years. I've also served as the men's soccer coach there for 17 years. I earned a doctorate in curriculum and teaching at BU. I've substitute taught in middle school and high schools, run summer camps, after school programs. I've personally worked with over 5,000 kids, most of who are from unrepresented, underserved communities, and a lot of kids from Somerville. From that experience, I've learned that our education should take a strength-based perspective to focus on the kids' strengths. The majority of the kids I've worked with might lack for money or academic background, but the kids are awesome. They have savvy, smart, funny people with real-world problem-solving skills, language skills, and we need to appreciate those. When we do that, when the kids are appreciated for what they have, they feel they belong, they're more likely to succeed. We can do that with a whole ecology approach to education, affordable out-of-school programs, college readiness, early language programs, recruit teachers that represent the community the kids are from, wraparound services to help stabilize the kids' lives. And I think if we do that, we can keep progressing. We've made a lot of progress in Somerville already. And I think
We have Sarah Dion, followed by Andre Green, Greg Nadeau, Sarah Phillips, and Laura Paton.
All right. Good evening, friends. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Sarah Dion. I use she, her pronouns. I teach elementary school English learners in the Medford Public Schools, and I am running for the Open School Committee seat in Ward 7. As an educator, I understand the needs of students. As a step parent, I understand the needs of families. And as a labor organizer, I understand the needs of education workers. I'm running in order to bring an educator organizer's voice to the Somerville School Committee. I believe that strong unions make for strong communities. As a teacher, I experience the benefits of union membership every day, and as an organizer, I have worked to strengthen my union. I believe that the MCAS testing system is punitive and harmful. It doesn't measure achievement, it measures privilege, and I stand with my fellow educators who have conscientiously objected to administering the tests. I believe that racial justice and education justice are deeply intertwined. In order to create true equity for all students, we must address any aspects of structural racism within our school system. I believe in transparency. I believe that as elected officials, school committee members should be accountable to the public. Executive sessions should be a rare occurrence, and we should work towards an open collective bargaining model. Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to answering all of your questions this evening.
Andre Green.
Good evening. Thanks, everyone. And feels like I'm among friends. I know most of the people in attendance. My name is Andre Green, and I am the representative from Ward 4, and I have been since 2016. When I was elected, I had the shameful honor of being only the second person of color elected to the Somerville School Committee in the history of Somerville, a distinction I still hold. And I ran then as I'm running now because I firmly believe that public education saves lives. It saved mine. And we fail too many of our students. We want educational equity. That's a long-term task. That's one I've committed my life to. When I'm not serving the Somerville School Committee, I am also a professional in the anti-poverty space. I'm a past executive director of Fair Test, so I've led the charge on standardized testing issues, working alongside here in Massachusetts, MTA, as well as teachers unions in Indiana, New Jersey, Oregon, and Kentucky. I now work on workforce development issues, where we work with schools and community colleges to break cycles of poverty. And that is the mindset I bring to my work every day in the school committee. I think people who know it and have worked with me know that I do that in a spirit of coalition building and fair sharing, where even when people don't agree with me or I don't agree with them, they know that I'm doing this in a way that tries to bring people together towards shared common goals. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I continue to do this work.
Greg Nadeau.
Great. So look, I'm not just running to represent Ward 7 to the school committee to continue addressing equity, fairness, and joy. I've been doing that as a volunteer activist and advocate for our young people for over 20 years. I started and ran an after-school program that funded a free slot for each paid student. I led the plan that will transform the back of the Healy this summer to a magnificent new park. I served as treasurer of the campaign to fund the state-of-the-art new high school. And for the last few years, I've served as president of the Somerville Education Foundation, raising and distributing over $300,000 to support basic needs, equitable access to out-of-school time, and applied learning. Honestly, I'll keep dedicating my volunteer time to these priorities, whether I'm elected or not. I made the decision to run for school committee to change the basic way that the school committee functions. I believe recent problems regarding school reopening, wage fairness for paraprofessionals, and mandatory reporting all stem from an overuse of executive sessions and formal meeting processes. In the place of subcommittee meetings that follow stilted rules, a broad array of in-person and digital methods could be used to gather input from all, with a special focus on non-English speakers and teens. When the school committee does meet, all meetings must be recorded, transcribed, translated, and posted for all. If elected to the Ward 7 School Committee, I will transform the status quo and bring innovative thinking and deep compassion for all. I'd appreciate support from anyone who would like to work with me.
Sarah Phillips.
Good evening. My name is Sarah Phillips, and I'm running for re-election in Ward 3. As many of you know, I grew up in an activist family. My parents helped start one of the oldest women's centers in the country, and one of my earliest memories is skating away for the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. After college, I taught middle school in Oakland, California, and high school in the County Juvenile Hall. These experiences were the first time I saw structural racism and classism firsthand, and I've spent the rest of my career working to build more equitable schools and communities. With a master's degree in social work from the University of Michigan and a PhD in social policy from Brandeis University, I spent 6 years as a community social worker and now work as an education researcher. My kids go to the Argenziano, and I've been active in Somerville's education scene since moving to town in 2010. It's been an honor to represent Ward 3 during the coronavirus pandemic, and I'm proud that during my first term in office, I proposed and helped pass policies improving inclusivity in our schools, including a recent motion to pause the SRO and STEPS program. I helped the school committee establish metrics and thresholds for school reopening, and I was a strong ally to our paraprofessionals. I'm running for re-election because I want to keep representing my community as we rebuild and reinvent ourselves post-pandemic, and I hope to earn your endorsement tonight. Thank you.
And Laura Patel.
Thank you to ORS. This is a ton of work to have a forum like this, but a great benefit to the community. My name is Laura Patone. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. It's been an honor to represent Ward 5 in the school committee for nearly 8 years, and now seeking your consideration for my 5th term. I ran the first time because I wanted to support our students, educators, and community involving the district to better understand and meet the needs of all of our families. I have been part of so much change. I've participated in hiring our current superintendent. As the school committee chair, I led the development of our long-range priorities focused on equity, from policy to how we allocate funds and programming, and responded to and advocated for countless families and students. Now we are in times demanding radical change, which is exciting, and I want to be intentional, thoughtful, and inclusive. The COVID pandemic not only stalled or halted plans for so many, it highlighted the inequities in our community. I am striving to be anti-racist, but I, like our district and city, have ways to go on this journey. As a member of the school committee, I will continue to listen deeply, creating new avenues for input and two-way dialogue, challenge myself and others. With your help, I love the input and being challenged. Dig deeper to understand and analyze, especially tapping into the expertise of our community. Be clear about what we're trying to accomplish, be creative in how to get there, pursuing systemic and sustainable change in the interest of equity and opportunity for all our students. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from you, my current and potential future colleagues during this forum.
Thank you all. So now we'll move on to our first question for all the candidates. Number 1, after this year, what would you say are the issues that the school committee should consider with regard to a reopening plan in the fall? And how will you work with your colleagues, Somerville educators, and your constituents to address those issues? The order for this question will be Sarah Dion, Andre Green, Greg Nadeau, Sarah Phillips, Laura Patone, and Scott Benjamin. Sarah?
I think the main consideration, at least for elementary school, is what will the timeline be for the vaccine rollout for children under 12? Because we still have no information, to my knowledge, about that right now. I think that for middle and high school, who are at the age where they can get the vaccine, I think, encouraging, reaching out to families and encouraging them to get their children vaccinated, and especially families of different language backgrounds, and encouraging them to get their children vaccinated and helping them to understand that getting their children vaccinated is the best way to return to normal. So I think that's huge. And since we don't know what the vaccination rollout for younger children will look like, I think being an elementary teacher myself, that's where my mind usually goes. I think in terms of bringing back the kids at that age, we'll really want to listen to parent concerns about their children's health if children at that age aren't able to be vaccinated by back to school time. If they are, then we'll hopefully be able to go fully in person with everybody, teachers and students, being vaccinated. But if the rollout doesn't happen in that timeline, then I think, ensure the kids that have been remote this year, making sure they feel safe with whatever they're doing. And their
Sorry, you can go ahead, Andre.
So I think the biggest issue for reopening is the same issue it was before the pandemic started, right? Like the COVID pandemic didn't create new problems. It just revealed and magnified all the ones that existed beforehand. We have deeply inequitable school systems, which meant that the fallout from this landed inequitably. And going forward, we are in month 15 of this pandemic, and we have still received zero leadership from the state on education issues, other than be Canton, have lots of open free space, have lots of extra money, and they'll be fine. We do not have either of those things in Somerville, so our challenge has been a little more concrete. As Ms. Dion pointed out, going into this next year, there's no vaccine for children yet. I have a 7-year-old. Having to explain to her why she still has to wear a mask when adults don't is, a parenting nightmare to begin with. But we are in a situation where, despite that, the state has made it clear we are doing a full reopening in the fall. And if we don't have the space to socially distance, that's our problem. This has been the state's MO from the beginning. So I think in the light of that, we have worked this last year to handle COVID in a way that is collaborative. I think we've spent hundreds of hours with the union trying to figure out how to be safe, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think the number one issue continues to be mental health for kids. When I talk to teens, what they say to me, even before the pandemic, is that mental health was their number one concern. By some estimates, the mental health issues have quadrupled in need. I believe that what we should be doing this summer is committing even more resources to summer learning programs to reduce anxieties and smooth the transition back to school. We need to get kids to fall back in love with learning. We need to focus on the additional supports of intensive tutoring out of school time in order to help kids transition fully back into to success. We need to provide family support. We need to be providing much more support through the family liaisons, wraparound services. Kids are not ready to learn if their family members are in jeopardy. So we need to work together, the school district, the city, and the community to make sure that all of the 5,000 families in Somerville with school-age kids provide the support they need.
Sarah Phillips.
Thank you. As we rebuild and re-envision our schools post-pandemic, I have two priorities. The first is a student and healing-centered recovery for all our kids. The coronavirus pandemic was traumatic for many of our students, but I don't want this trauma to be the defining feature of their lives. As we move into next year, I'm looking for a budget that supports expansive programming that's individualized and focused on healing. I want a holistic team supporting our kids. I want us to have enough staff to meet their unprecedented needs, and I want us to make space in our schedule to support students as they process their experiences and receive additional support. My second priority is, as always, building diverse, equitable, and inclusive classrooms and schools. We need to continue building the cultural competence and critical consciousness of our staff. We need to improve culture and climate building programs like responsive classroom and restorative justice. We need to develop an inclusive and culturally relevant curriculum. And we need to continue working to diversify our teaching force and integrate our schools. Thank you.
Laura Patel.
Thank you. I kind of bucket it into, so we have technical concerns and we have relationship concerns. Technically, we have to be prepared. Our buildings need to be ready to open. We need to have safety plans that are appropriate. We have to determine whether or not we have to continue doing COVID testing. There's just a lot of things to consider, and they need to be done in collaboration with our educators and transparent, open communication with our families. On the other space, and I think the other candidates cover this well, is relational and thinking about where our students are. I don't think anybody who hasn't been plugged in schools doesn't realize, particularly for some of our older students, our high school students, how devastating this year has been, whether it's been in their family, losses associated with COVID, or just, isolation, depression, anxiety. Our students have struggled considerably. Our educators have been really under pressure and have been in a tough place. We have all these wonderful people that are in hard times, and we need to meet them where they're at. And we need to figure out the best way to support our educators as well as our families moving forward from a mental health perspective, as well as from an academic perspective. It's going to be a period of healing and restoration. And I think we have to have that attitude about it as we move forward, that we need to deal with the technical things, and those are super important, vaccines, all that good stuff, but also the relationships and how do we make those connections for people, and how do we move everyone forward so they recover as best we can from this incredibly devastating year.
And Scott Benjamin.
It's hard to add to what everybody has kind of echoed here, but one, the technical aspects that Laura mentioned, I think we do need to concentrate that. I'm also a biology professor, and the issues with vaccines and with planning ahead. So if there's a surge, if things change in the fall, we need to be prepared, because we were caught unprepared. Of course we were, right? So I think that is of a concern. Going along the other way, I think something I could add to this is we need to improve our communication with our students. So, I mean, we talk a lot about mental health issues. They're there. We know they're there. And academic gaps that have formed. We need to find out what those are so we can prepare correctly, so our great teachers can actually help that. And so we need to communicate with our teachers better. We need to communicate with the kids as well in a more formalized way this year in particular, because we don't know what the exact gaps are for each child. We need more funds for individualized learning, like Sarah had mentioned, because each kid is going to be a little different. It's not going to be the kind of thing where we can just throw a blanket menu and solve all the problems. So increased communication, I think, is key. I do think we need to be aware of the technical difficulties and the potential that will arise. But I really think we need to assess where we're at so we can work and move forward for more equity and close some of the gaps academically and mentally that have.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to question number 2. To what extent do you believe police should interact with our schools, and what steps will you take to implement that vision? And we'll begin with Andre Green.
So I have been consistent, as a person of color, as a Black man in America, in my skepticism of modern policing. However, that skepticism is also tempered by the fact that the communities I represent, the Mystics, are both under and over policed. Over policed, and as much as we are all suspects, under policed in much of this, they are overwhelmingly more likely to be the victims of crime, and overwhelmingly more likely to have those crimes go unsolved and uninvestigated. So I have always believed that when it comes to issues in our schools and our community, issues of policing, procedure is policy. And if we address policing in a racist, uninclusive way, whatever we do as policy change will also be racist and uninclusive. So to that extent, I have pushed for a robust and complete community process to review our policing, including sponsoring money in this year's budget to do what is going to be the most robust community outreach program in the history of Somerville schools, to make sure that the families who are most affected by policing, so our special education families, our insane language families, are the families driving the conversation, not just whoever happens to have the loudest voice because of voices of privilege. And I am proud to say that whatever comes out of that process will be better and more fair policing than what we have now, and will be done in a better and more fair way that actually makes sure that people closest to the pain, closest to the power.
Greg, Nadeau?
And my personal views are that armed uniformed police officers should only be in the presence of kids when there is an immediate direct threat to violence. I don't doubt that SROs and STEP programs can do some good, but the question about whether or not that's the most cost-effective way to do good with kids, I think we know that the average time for a police officer to be working is much more expensive than a social worker or a youth worker. But I think the more important question here is, how does the school committee make these decisions? When the school committee made these decisions, there were no students present. I think that is a huge mistake. I think if we don't have teens present in all decisions, particularly the ones that they have the best view and understanding of, then we do a disservice to the community. So I would support, again, that we stop having formalized meetings with Robert's Rules of Orders, that we replace the subcommittee meetings with community-based groups that pull in teens, teachers, and community members to work together, and that we have much more open, transparent collaboration around these issues. Whenever we have a meeting and there aren't kids present, we should leave an empty chair and do a better job next year of having kids there. Nothing about us without us is for us.
Thank you. Sarah Phillips.
Working in West Oakland and juvenile hall, I was part of the school to prison pipeline. And because of those experiences, I'm extremely wary of inviting police into our schools. And that's part of the reason why I moved to formally put a pause on the SRO and STEPS programs a few weeks ago. I also moved to put a pause because I was concerned about the way we were talking about the role of police in our schools. And I wanted to make sure that we had fully considered all the ramifications, all the potential consequences before we made a decision. I'm really excited that the school committee is about to start working in earnest on a policy about the role and function of police in our schools. At a meeting in May, I recommended that this policy is comprehensive, that it cover all the police activity conducted in partnership with our schools, that it codifies our commitment to prevention and restorative justice, that it identifies the roles or functions that we actually think require legitimate police support, that we establish safeguards for students that ensure the support interrupts the school to prison pipeline, not enhances it, and that we hold ourselves accountable in policy for ensuring that implementation does not disparately and negatively impact kids of color. I also don't believe that incidents involving a student under the age of criminal intent require legitimate police support. So if elected, I'll work to ensure that that is part of our policy. As always, I'm a strong supporter of youth voice, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Laura Patone.
I think Andre did an excellent job outlining the approach that the school committee is currently taking towards trying to understand, in the worldview and at least the US view of how policing is, and everybody's incredibly valid concerns about the discrimination and the disproportionate impact on youth of color, as well as people of color in terms of policing and negative experiences. That is the worldview, and then figuring out what the Somerville view is in that space. So I'm really glad that in particular, Mr. Green put forward funds to make sure that we could really resource a community process to understand how all our students are feeling and how our families are feeling, as well as how our educators are feeling. There's kind of been a pendulum swing. When Parkland happened, there was a whole shift in towards policing around safety and concerns of safety. Now we're so much more aware, at least in the broader community, about our concerns of Black Lives Matter. And so now the pendulum is switching in the other direction. And I think it's really thoughtful and good. And I'm really looking forward to figuring out what that means for Somerville, and in supportive of what we're hearing, and making that policy to guide our direction and following that policy, because things can get kind of murky and we don't want to be in that space anymore. So thank you.
Thank you. Scott Benjamin.
Yeah, I have a problem with police in schools. I have worked a lot with police in community programs when I worked for the Boys and Girls Club, saw even some benefits from those things. At Bunker Hill Community College, we're an open college. We have police officers, Boston police officers there. And you know, the kids, particularly undocumented immigrants that I work with, and a lot of kids who have had experiences, they're just not comfortable with police in the environment. And I know we're trying to make what we say a safe and secure environment for all the kids. And of course we want that, but it's not safe and secure for them because they don't feel that way with that presence. So, you know, again, I have seen the benefits from some programs, but not in the schools per se. So I would not support police in the school. You know, I've seen, for example, career programs with students who are interested in criminal justice working with police outside of the school, and that's been great community bonding. I'm also not a fan of just eliminating the police, because if we divide, there's more division. If we make the divide, there's more division. And so, I mean, I think the school committee now is taking those steps towards finding a policy that figures out what we really need in terms of safety, but what can be done other ways, especially within the school, restorative justice programs, things like that. There's a lot. We don't need armed police officers in the school to take care of a lot of.
Thank you. And Sarah Dion.
Hi. This is always tough for me because I need to, you know, acknowledge that as a white person, I am coming from a place of white privilege. And I think that, you know, the conversation surrounding this issue should really center Black voices and voices of color. So I think that any policy that we would enact as a school committee definitely needs to have, as others have said, a lot of input from the families and the students that are most affected by this, which, yeah, Black and other people of color, undocumented immigrants that, you know, that can't feel like they're in a safe and secure learning space if there are armed police officers there. It's kind of like, you know, the people who said that like teachers should start carrying guns. It's like, if you're in an institution of learning and there's someone there that has a weapon, that is just going to be a cognitive dissonance for the students there, especially students of color who, you know, have maybe had family members who have had negative interactions with police and are bringing that trauma and are not going to be in the best headspace for learning if there are police in the schools. So I think that anything that we do needs to be, the voices of people of color need to be prioritized.
Thank you all. Moving on to question number 3. Would you help implement an independent equity audit of the Somerville Public Schools? And what other accountability measures will you commit to tonight to address the school to prison pipeline and racial equity? And we'll begin with Greg Nadeau.
I'm involved with equity audits professionally in the work that I do as a consultant. I believe they're an important part of an overall strategy. I think it is essential that we begin to publish clear, measurable metrics associated with the policies that we care about. I don't know that an independent equity audit on top of our equity staff is the most important equity initiatives. To me, the most important equity initiatives are providing more equitable access to out-of-school time programming. We know that kids who are vulnerable in poverty catch up during the school day, fall behind nights, weekends, and summers. That is the #1 priority for us to address in equity. Related to equity is diversity. We need to do a much better job of diversifying our teaching staff to have them reflect the students, and inclusion, which I've talked about in terms of how students are involved in decision-making and through their families.
Thank you. Sarah Phillips.
I'm happy to support an independent equity audit of the Somerville Public Schools. I think the real question is, what are we using this audit to focus on? For example, we have already committed to conducting an audit of our curriculum. but I don't think that's gonna affect policing as directly as some folks may be interested in. So I think the first thing is, what is it we wanted to focus on? I think focusing on the process by which kids get referred to the office and then referred out and police get involved would be really useful. And I would absolutely support that. Other things that I think we need based on my own experience working in juvenile hall, my kids got arrested and went to jail because there were no after school programs in the community. So they were stealing bikes to have some fun. They went to jail because they were selling drugs, because there were no jobs for teens in the community. So I think we need expansive after school programs, teen employment programs. My kids who were in jail, lots of them were kids who had the skills to succeed academically, and they were totally bored by the schools that they were given. I think we need to do a much better job of meeting our kids where they're at individually, keeping class sizes low, providing all sorts of enrichment programs and challenging programs during the day to help kids succeed in school and see that as a viable life option. In addition to that, all of the things that I mentioned in relation to the last question, I think totally apply. And I apologize, Chris, I can't see you. Now.
Thank you. Laura Patton.
Thank you. I definitely would support an independent equity audit. I think that some of the other candidates have put out there, like, what is going to be the focus of that type of work. We are fortunate to have not only a director of equity excellence, but we also have these equity teams in the district. I think one of the things that we've already started having conversations about is how do we resource and support our educators that are involved in this. So we have high school teachers that have some adjusted workloads. It's harder to do that in the elementary. So how do we solve that problem to make sure that the educators are able to be involved and affect the change? Because a lot of this is cultural work. I appreciate that Mr. Nadeau brought up the idea of clear and measurable metrics. That's something that's near and dear to my heart in terms of the work I've done in other spaces. Currently, right now, they're focusing on internal metrics, and I've challenged that group to create more of a strategic plan and have this external view, because I think our community really needs to understand where we are. I'm very excited about the work that we planned a while ago for long range around weighted student formula to make sure that we're equitably distributing resources. So we're funding students that have greater needs in the schools they're at with greater resources. I think the way you allocate money really reflects your values as an organization and as a school and a district, and adjusting how we allocate our funds, I think, is going to be huge. And then the work that we're planning on doing regarding an enrollment study to better understand where we are as a district and be intentional. Right now, we have schools that have a lower socioeconomic status and a higher socioeconomic status. We have schools that have a larger white population and a larger Black and brown population. And I think
That is time. Thank you. Next is Scott Benjamin.
Yeah, I would support an independent audit. We have an equity and diversity team here of qualified people. I would think that if that worked together, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but so we knew what it was focusing on specifically, what we were focusing on, and to utilize the strengths of our diversity team that we have already in the school district, I think is important. In terms of, what I would commit to is more resources for, trying to stop that prison, school to prison pipeline with, I mentioned it before, restorative justice programs, quality after school programs, like Greg had mentioned. I'm a big advocate of that. I have seen that personally, worked with a lot of kids who were, on the edge, and because they worked in after school programs or with, soccer, basketball, arts programs, became part of the community and then were valued for what they brought. And as a result, they did well academically, and they had advocates for them who could, keep them in the educational ecology, the net of that. So I think resources for that kind of thing is important when we're going to address equity issues.
Thank you. Sarah Dion?
Yeah, I think that if there were to be an independent equity audit, I think that would definitely be, in addition to what's already being done with the Director of Equity and Excellence, and the work that's already being done within the district. But I mean, an independent audit might shine a light on some aspects that maybe other people, that maybe hadn't been considered. So I think it would be worthwhile. I think in terms of what I would commit to, I think that the district should be offering quality professional development in anti-racism and cultural competency for all faculty. I think that should be a mandatory professional development that is offered by the district, because you can't do better until you know better. And so we want to make sure that all of our faculty and staff know better so that we can all do better. And so I think that that's important. I think that also just really looking at policies that may come up and, really looking at them from the lens of anti-racism. And again, that probably means involving members of the community as well in a capacity. I also think that, okay, I guess I am done. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Andre Green.
I'm going to try to move really quickly here. So the first thing I want to say is that big, comprehensive equity audits of large multimillion organizations, by and large, don't work. They are, by and large, the products of white consultants selling to white organizations products designed to appease white stakeholders. What we actually want is a series of targeted systems-based evaluations of our curriculum, of our HR policies, of our salaries, of each of our systems as individual things, so that we can look at them in a deeper way than a comprehensive equity audit. We do some of that work already. I've already spoken with our Director of Equity and Excellence, however, who is on maternity leave, so the stuff will wait till the fall when she returns, about how we can do a job of making that work transparent to the public so that people can see that HR report that's been done. So as we complete in the fall our salary equity report, we can make sure that's available to the public. That's how we become accountable of actually showing the things that we are doing, have done, and need to do. To that end, also, we want to talk about how it is that we actually create systems that shift resources and power. As Mr. Patone pointed out, two of the big places in which our resources become inequitably distributed are the way we budget, which is based on the equality model, and on our enrollment model, which is school choice for those who can afford it. So we need to look at those and how do we fix that? And that's how we actually shift power, because if you don't shift power, you're not talking about equity.
Thank you. So moving on to our fourth question. The Somerville School Committee has a record of deliberating behind closed doors in executive session, followed by a unanimous vote in open session. The current City Council President, who also sits on the school committee, filed a complaint regarding the misuse of executive session. How will you increase the transparency of the school committee? And we'll begin with Sarah Phillips.
So I can't talk publicly about executive session, but I think the issue with unanimity is both cultural, right? There was a real move on the school committee, I don't know, about a decade ago to always make unanimous decisions, but I think it's also structural, right? Like we have hiring and firing power over the superintendent. So because we like her, because we keep renewing her contract, we tend to vote in support of her when we take votes. So I think that's a lot of the unanimity. For me, I think increasing accountability and transparency is a lot about really publicly making decisions. And I've really pushed us to make decisions as a group, whether it's to invite experts to come talk to us about coronavirus transmission in schools, or whether it's to formally, as the school committee, put a pause on the SRO and STEPS program. For me, that's about increasing accountability and transparency to our constituents. I also think it's about going to meet people where they're at, right? That's, things that I've done that have done that is really helping to build relationships with organizations like Connection and Teen Empowerment on the Welcome Project, doing office hours with them, having meetings where the school committee comes to talk to them about their concerns, and then following up. So I think a good example of that, and I'll stop.
Thank you. Laura Patone.
Thank you. Again, I can't really talk too much about executive session in particular, but I do think that we're responsible to hold each other accountable in terms of what can be covered in an executive session. When is something like that really necessary, and when can we do something publicly, which for me, the lean is towards as much as we can do in public is what I'd like to see. In terms of increasing transparency, it's a tricky job. I've been doing this job for a few years, and it can take as much time as you give it. And I've invested my time in being as much as I can present in schools. So going to events, going to activities, meeting families. You can hold office hours, which I do, and I'm happy we do that systemically. It's something I'm actually really proud that we implemented, but we're not reaching certain families through those things. So it doesn't mean you have to eliminate them, but you have to come to these other ways and places to engage with the community and engage in a way that it's relevant to them and they're interested in it. Sometimes when you're talking about policy, some people, it doesn't seem to be relative to their real life, but really making sure that we're communicating in such a way that it is relevant. I'm on the Charter Reform Review Committee, and we're really working hard to make sure, why would anybody care about the city charter? Well, the city charter determines where there's power and who makes the decisions. And so that is actually really important to every constituent. So my time's up, sorry.
Thank you. Scott Benjamin.
Yeah, executive session, there are legal reasons that you need to have that. And I think, though, there are ways that can grow out of control. And being very cognizant of the criteria, setting criteria of when that narrow window is when you need to use executive session, I think is very important. And then I mean, again, communicating with our constituents, as Sarah and Laura have just mentioned, is really important, because that exposes what you're doing. If you can communicate the policies that you're trying to pass on or that you're discussing, you can get more feedback in it. And essentially that should make it more transparent, because you're hearing from the community and you're adding that voice to the policies that you're working on. And, I don't know, because I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know how the actual sort of legal issues of executive session to how you can get rid of those if you need to, or whatever. I'm just not an expert on that. I'm sorry. But I think being very cognizant of when you can use it, when you don't, is important. And then I think really trying to communicate your policies and your ideas to the community so they know, so that gives us some transparency.
Thank you. Sarah Dion.
This is huge for me, because as a union member and as someone who's been very active within my union, the idea of school committee members meeting behind closed doors in executive session to plan strategy before negotiations of how are we gonna, counter what the union wants, that idea just betrays my values as a labor activist. And that just how normal it is to do that almost made me, that was something I considered when I was deciding whether or not I wanted to run, because I was if it's will be expected of me to go to these secret meetings to plan how to counter the union's demands, I don't want to betray my union siblings like that. And I was worried that, that was maybe I wanted to kind of say that publicly as part of my platform, but I was worried that might be too radical a position for some people. But it seems like a lot of people are at least somewhat in agreement, that I do think that, and I'm interested in looking at these these, specific reasons for executive session, because I didn't know that this document existed. And so I think that really sticking to that, and not using them as a way to kind of keep anything secret.
Thank you. Andre Green.
So since my time on school committee, I have been a tireless champion for transparency and feedback. One of my first actions on the school committee was to draft a policy that returned public comment to schools after a 20-year absence. I have been doing office hours in the Mystics and with the Welcome Project doing office hours in Spanish since I got on school committee. Being responsive to the people who aren't used to having a school committee listen to them has been central to my approach to this work. This year that was tough, both because of the nature of remote life, but also because, and I think the SEU knows that I support the fact that they have become more assertive in asserting teacher rights. But we spent a lot of this year negotiating 4 MOUs. I think 4, maybe even more than that. And one of the 10 legal reasons for that is to actually be able to negotiate with the unions. And there is actually a good reason for that, which is that as I have always aspired to do, especially now as chair again, it's important that whenever we come to agreements with the unions, that we can stand behind them as a whole. So that whatever process it takes to get to an agreement, once we have an agreement, it's what the whole union stands for, the whole body stands for. And to that end, we need to be able to negotiate with some degree of strategic thinking behind closed doors.
Thank you. And Greg Nadeau.
Yeah, as I stated earlier, I believe that formal school committee meetings should be fewer, shorter, and more effective. When they happen, they should be transcribed, translated, and broadcast. I believe executive sessions should only exist when there is confidential person shared. I don't believe that executive sessions should be used to discuss tactics regarding collective bargaining. I think that wage fairness should be addressed through long-term commitments to regular raises and comparisons to other communities. But I'm committed to even more fundamental changes in the way that we make our decisions as a community. As I said, I believe we should replace our subcommittee meetings with working groups that always involve school committee members with teens, parents, and teachers. I believe that we should have digital discussion boards where people are able to communicate. I believe we should have focus groups that are in language where the translation is to English, not the other way around. And I think that we need to really change the whole way that we operate around decisions supporting the schools. Most importantly, having students involved in every step of the way.
Thank you. Now moving on to question 5. How have you been working, or how will you work to improve language access in your office hours? And will you commit to canvassing your ward to listening to families' feedback and concerns, especially families with accessibility limitations in communication with school officials? And we'll begin with Laura Patone.
I was extremely proud when the school committee made the decision to move forward and start having interpretation at our meetings. One thing about, and I supported that 110%. One thing about office hours that's tricky is I think that if you want to reach families that English is not their primary language, you need to meet those families where they are. I can't go sit in a coffee shop at Diesel or Balsabor Cafe or whatever it is and expect families to come there. We need to be where those families are. We're very fortunate that there's a multilingual parent advisory council that exists. We can't all meet with them at once, the school committee, but now we're starting to implement a more formal way that we engage with that community. So I'm absolutely open, but I don't want to think that we have a one size fits all. What we use for certain families, I think we have to figure out and use a better method that reaches those families, and whether it's digital methods, using WhatsApp, I'm game for anything. Obviously that takes resources and time. So we as a school committee have to determine how do we want to prioritize our energy and resources to make these kinds of things happen. So we've made this investment in our school committee meetings. We need to figure out how to make our best investment so that we're talking to the families of other things they want to talk about and we're hearing from them. And like I said, I also, the idea of canvassing the community, very interesting, and I'm happy to do anything, but thanks.
Thank you. Scott Benjamin.
Running for the seat, we get out and we canvass, and I've already, spoken to a number of people. I have connections from the days that I worked in North Street, which is here in Ward 7, to speak to some people, and it's interesting. I was speaking to a woman, a Haitian woman who's a grandmother of a child at West Somerville, and I was telling her that I was running, and asking her, like, how can I get more involved? How can I communicate with more folks? And I know this sounds funny. And she said, you need to have a party. And this is the funny part. I was talking to one of my former athletes who is an East Somerville undocumented person. I said, how can the school committee in general communicate? I was asking about some other questions, and he said, have a party. And at West Somerville, we've had things called cultural nights, and the community has come out. And in that case, again, folks are proud to share their culture, their food and their music. But that's an opportunity to communicate. And I mean, really, we have to be creative if we want to, because not everybody, like Laura said, is going to come to Diesel Cafe. It's not where they go, right? It's not where everybody goes. And so I think community forums that might be in the form of a party might actually help to address some of these issues.
Thank you. Next is Sarah Dion.
Yeah, I think that this is really important, and this is something that, as a teacher this year, I feel like that communication with families, especially during this year, has a lot of it has fallen on the teachers. And so I use an app called Talking Points to communicate with my students' families, and it automatically translates, and it's an app. They can get the app on their phone. If they don't have the app on their phone, they just receive it as text, and it works so well. It has astronomically increased the level of my communication with families. And I think I've been very vocal in my own district where I teach that, that the district should be getting the district version of Talking Points and using that to send out any sort of important communications to families. And I wonder if there could be because I know there's the teacher version and there's the district version of the app. And I wonder if there could also be a version for school committee members. I'm on the teacher advisory panel of that app, and that's definitely something I could bring up at our next meeting, because I think that would be a fantastic way to communicate with families of all languages. I also in the I have my own canvassing script that I'm using to canvass right now. I have it translated into Spanish. I'm working on getting my candidate website translated into Spanish. And that I speak enough Spanish to have basic conversations. Thank you.
Next is Andre Green.
Sorry about that. My first office hour ever as a member of the school committee was held in the Mystic Housing Projects. And actually, famously, we got one person to attend because, as we later learned, people just didn't honestly believe politicians came to the Mystics. We have since worked on that to the point where my last office hour, in-person office hours before the pandemic, was also at the Mystics in conjunction with State Representative Barber. And to Mr. Benjamin's point, we had a party, we had a cookout, and the representative and I brought food, and we had grown that one person 2 hours to 20 people. And we had a really good conversation about, that was our last event before the pandemic shut down in-person meetings. As I've mentioned, I have done Spanish language office hours in conjunction with the Welcome Project. I was the chair that brought in full translation of school committee meetings. Being as accessible as possible has always been, I think, the most important thing I've tried to bring to this body. I've actually been criticized by activists in this room for not being at events because I was at town meetings in the Mystics, including the largest event I think the largest gathering of people of color in the city of Somerville on an annual basis is the Mystic Clarendon Picnic in August. And I have been there every year. I have made sure that the school department has been a sponsor of that event every year. And I hope to see more of my colleagues there if they're serious about actually meeting with people where they are.
Great, Nadell.
Yeah, so as I've said now, I believe the key is young people. We need to work through them to involve their families. Many adults are not comfortable expressing themselves about public opinion. Young people have fewer barriers and can bring their families' perspectives. And yes, as Scott and Andre said, social gatherings with food are excellent as well. But we need to be much more intentional and scientific about how we seek input and not so casual. We need to use focus groups, surveys, and other means in order to make sure that we're properly representing all the different perspectives. Interpreters at formal meetings simply is not effective or sufficient. And we need to do much better than that. We need to, yes, when we have meetings, they all should be transcribed, translated, and posted publicly so that people can know what has occurred. It's frankly not that important for people to always see the meeting in their language live. There are other ways to get their involvement prior to the meeting, prior to the decisions being made, that are more important. So I would suggest that we we do all of those things. And for canvassing, I've certainly been out there across the district now and meeting all the different people that make up the district. And there are very few who have families in this city. As people who have been canvassing know, only about 5 to 10% of voters have kids in schools.
And Sarah Phillips.
So I was able to do one round of office hours before the pandemic hit in 2020. And I moved my office hours. My predecessor used to do them at places like Forge. I moved them to the public library. I reached out to the Immigrant Services Unit to find out how I could get materials translated, how I could get a translator. I wasn't successful. During the pandemic, I was excited to coordinate multilingual office hours with the Welcome Project that Andre facilitated for us. That was a fantastic step in the right direction. I was excited to support translation at school committee meetings and enhanced outreach to our community during the coming year. I think, one of my old bosses used to joke, I don't have the complexion to make a connection, and I need to build relationships with cultural bridges in order to authentically hear the voices of people who don't speak English and who are immigrants in our community. And that's a slow process, but one that I'm working on through one-on-one meetings and through being out in the community. In terms of canvassing, absolutely. As many of you know, because you helped, last election season, I knocked on 8,000 doors in Ward 3. I love canvassing. I love listening to people and their concerns on the doors. And I'm excited to get back out there again.
Thank you. Next, number 6. Historically, school committee members did not attend negotiations with the Somerville Educators Union and instead sent their lawyer to represent them. During the recent negotiations in the last term, this practice changed to include some school committee members, but as silent observers. What role do you think school committee members should play in contract negotiations with the SCU? And please explain. And we'll begin with Scott Benjamin.
Okay. I think because the school committee members serve as a voice for the community, that is why we are elected to serve as a voice for our constituents and for the kids. I think it's important that that actual school committee members have a voice in those negotiations. So I think this year, the step to have school committee members involved is a step in the right direction. but the school committee is also working with the union because we are also, working with teachers. So it's an interesting situation that school committee finds themselves in. I do think that they need to have a voice in the negotiations besides, their lawyer that is sent. That's part of transparency. Again, if school committee folks also have their, can have their input. And that's where I stand on that issue.
Sarah Dion.
Yeah, I was really surprised when I heard that no school committee members had been present at the paraprofessionals negotiation last year. I think that that's really essential that school committee members should be there, and I feel like if I were elected, my purpose for being there would just be to listen to the demands of the Somerville Educators Union and just figure out how to best support what it is they need, because what's good for teachers is good for students. We as teachers and other educators know what is needed in order to have successful schools. And I think that the role of school committee members should largely be to figure out, is there a way and how can we give the educators what they need? I think that the new initiative of bargaining for the common good is also really fantastic. And I think that as school committee members, that's definitely something that we can support and encourage the Somerville Educators Union in their bargaining for the common good, because we do represent the community, and the idea of bargaining for the common good is really using collective bargaining to get what's best for everyone, the community as a whole.
Thank you. Andre Green.
So I think it's always worth revisiting the proper approach to handle negotiations in a way that meets everyone's needs. When the decision was made years and years ago to not have school committee members directly in negotiation sessions, as is the case in in many, if not most, urban districts, it was actually a decision made to reduce school committee grandstanding in these negotiations and hopefully have them be more professional and more respectful than they had been in the past. When SCU asked for that to change, that was a consideration we took seriously and came with the current system. If the SCU formally asks us to change that again as we move into negotiations next year, I would hope that school committee would consider it. I also am mindful of the fact that school committee negotiates with 11 unions, 10 of which are not SCU. And I want to make sure that as we make negotiating and labor strategies, we're doing that thoughtful of the needs and wants of all of our unions. So I would love to, do what we haven't done in the past, which is to talk to those unions. And the school committee is well overdue to come up with a comprehensive labor strategy. That is something that we hope to take on this year before COVID aided. So it's something I hope we can manage to do next year. So that we are actually making decisions, as Greg Nadeau pointed out, I think correctly, with a long-term vision as opposed to going contract to contract, which has been our historic norm.
Thank you. Greg Nadeau.
Yeah, I think everyone should have a voice in the collective labor policies of the district. I don't think that collective bargaining should happen behind closed doors. I believe it should be open and transparent. I think the school committee's job is to integrate input from all the different sources and to derive principles that should guide our labor and policy rules. So I think there's something broken in the way that we're doing it. And so we need to do it very differently. I think that common sense would dictate that paraprofessionals should have a fair wage and that we should be compensating our educators at least at the level of neighboring communities. Why that doesn't translate into obvious compensation packages, I can't say. But I think it has a lot to do with the inherent adversarial process set up through multiple opaque, behind closed door executive sessions with tactics. And I just don't think that that serves the community or the educators.
Sarah Phillips.
Thank you. So my first motion on the school committee was actually to get school committee members present at negotiations. And I'm very proud that that was my first move. I think it's really important to have school committee members at negotiations. It's both just basic respect and also we're signing these contracts. I think we should be there. And I think we should play an active role. What I would love to see us engage in is interest-based negotiations. I think at the end of the day, all the key stakeholders share the same values. We have the same interests and our positions are never actually that far apart. When I joined the school committee, the salary offer on the table from the school committee for paraprofessionals was 24/7 and that's public. So we were fighting over $300 to the nail for $300. Job security, separate issue, still needed to be worked out. But what I would love to see us do is work together in the best interest of our community and our kids to get everybody what they need and deserve. Thanks.
And Laura Patone.
Thanks. My attitude is always just because that's the way we always have done things doesn't mean that that's the way we have to do them moving forward. When I was chair a few years ago, I brought in the training from MASC to talk about this question is what does it mean? We learned things like most urban districts do use their lawyers to negotiate. And, there's sort of this buffering that happens. But over the last several years, we kept asking that question. And through getting the request from the SEU, we went through and evaluated and decided that we wanted to bring in and we wanted to try it with having our members be silent. Well, we'll be frank, Andre and I were the first two, and there were many periods of time we were not silent, maybe not in the largest groups, but we did a bunch of small groups. And this is complicated work, obviously. And so I'm open to consider anything that the body wants to move forward with. You add more players, it makes it more complicated. You make it more public, it can be more complicated. And there is a risk of grandstanding, and there is a risk that people can't change their opinions once they've become public with something. And I don't mean private, like hiding it behind the room, but so I'm still thinking about this. I'm still considering it. I'm open to change. I do totally agree with Ms. Phillips or Dr. Phillips' reference to interest-based bargaining. I would love to see that in our district. I've learned a lot about it, and I don't know if we're ready for it or not. It has to take both players. So I hope that that's something we pursue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all. And now for our final question for each candidate, we're going to do something a little different. We've prepared a unique question for each of you that follows up on a specific aspect of your record or your written questionnaire submissions. And we will start with Sarah Dion. Individual school committee members support transparency, but have not succeeded in forcing much contested discussion into public view. What concrete steps will you take as an individual school committee member to make the body more transparent and accountable to Somerville residents?
That's a good question. I think that, what's already been mentioned about really keeping executive sessions to a minimum, and I would really advocate to, not use executive sessions as a way to discuss strategy before a collective bargaining. I just don't, again, that doesn't feel right to me as a labor activist and as someone who is, has been an educator and a member of the union. It's, kind of disheartening to me to think that school committee members are meeting behind closed doors to figure out how to counter what we want. So I would definitely advocate for, not using executive sessions in that way. I also think that, like things like what has already been said, just really improving the communication with families, especially families that don't speak English as their first language. as a teacher of English learners, that's all of my students' families. And so I feel like I have experience doing that, using technology and really just meeting people where they're at, and attending school events where there are going to be families that may not attend school committee meetings otherwise.
Thank you. This next question is for Andre Green. In your questionnaire, you do not answer directly whether you would support smaller class sizes or other questions relating to increasing the school budget to support educators and students. During the beginning of COVID-19, you took a vote in favor of asking for additional funding if needed, which is never acted upon. Since we know students are coming back with a high level of need this year, what concrete steps will you take to increase the budget for issues such as reducing class sizes, reducing special educators as caseloads, and increasing the number of social workers and counselors in every school?
So the budget we've passed does many of those things. It has lower class sizes. We project 200 fewer students and same number of teachers. We thought it was important this year for the reasons you said, to make sure we didn't reduce class sections, which means we expect to have lower class sizes. I have every year on the school committee, including this year, pushed for more mental health supports. This year we are making a fairly massive $1 million investment in mental health supports. And we know that as students come back and we do whatever they're calling normal in the fall, we know there are things that we're gonna have to do differently. I firmly believe that we will be using that ESSER money and ARPA money, and hopefully the RGA, the American Rescue Jobs Act money, to be doing more staffing up in our schools. I'm a proud champion of mental health supports. As I said, I've supported expanding that every year. I've been on school committee, we've done so. I expect we'll do so again this year, even beyond this budget. I think it's just important that we recognize what those needs are before you commit to specific things. If I knew they were already, I would have pushed for them. And as far as class sizes, I think we know that however small class sizes we can make, we need to find room for them.
Thank you. This next question is for Greg Nadeau. You stated in your questionnaire that you previously supported the MCAS, but that you now believe it is time to replace it with tests that are more efficient and fair. What is your position on standardized testing as a graduation requirement? And with what would you propose to replace the MCAS?
Yep. So unfortunately, MCAS has not progressed meaningfully from its origins, and it is now a bloated and inefficient instrument that creates anxiety in the community. I'm not against testing. I'm not against data. I don't think any of us should be. I think we should understand that it often reflects socioeconomics, but that doesn't make it important. Just because there are higher COVID test rates in Chelsea than in Wellesley doesn't mean we should not be testing for COVID. Same thing for student achievement. What I support is embedding meaningful standards-based mastery assessments in the curriculum that produce evidence of accomplishment to skills and communicates that to the learners, their parents, and other educators. I support very brief summative assessments that let us calibrate whether a system is doing better or worse. I don't think MCAS needs to produce individual student data. I don't think it does a good job of it. It's not timely, it's not helpful, but it is important to note those communities like Chelsea and Lawrence that had predominantly white school committees serving predominantly minority communities and doing a disservice to those communities. I think that it was important to expose those inefficiencies and to take action. So I would not want to replace that part of it. But in terms of high school graduation, in the history of MCAS, there's never been a single student in Somerville who has been denied a diploma because of failure to pass MCAS.
Thank you. This next question is for Sarah Phillips. You have stated publicly that Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Commissioner Riley's directive on school reopening aligned with your assessment of the path forward for school reopening? DESE's directive overrode every negotiated agreement between local unions and democratically elected school committees across the state. In addition, this directive threatened to withhold Chapter 70 funding, which disproportionately impacts school districts with high percentages of low-income students and students of color. Regardless of whether the outcome aligned with your vision of reopening for Somerville, do you see DESE's unprecedented directive as setting a dangerous precedent that challenges democracy in the local control of schools? Why or why not?
I do, but I think the pandemic was an unprecedented moment. And at that particular moment, I felt like DESE's decision was in the best interest of our kids. To understand my position, you kind of got to go way back to the beginning of the pandemic when Tessa Bridge called me to lobby me about the budget. And she did a really great job organizing me and agitating me by pointing out, like, if me as a school committee member is not out for the best interests of our kids, then who the hell in Somerville is going to be? And that has really been my guiding star, my North Star during the pandemic. And that was why I was pushing so hard for school reopening. It's not a position I came to lightly. Lots of you know my mom's dead, my daughter's dead. Like, I'm really risk averse about things that can kill you. But in December, when we started negotiating about metrics and thresholds, it was really clear that kids in Somerville were hurting, and they were hurting badly. So I was a fierce proponent of getting them back to school. I also really believed in the SEU's call for clear metrics and thresholds. I think we really needed to know how we were keeping everybody safe. And I worked really hard with colleagues at the table here to create proposals that both recognized real interest on the part of our educators in feeling safe, and also doctors' ideas about best practices for being safe.
Thank you. This next question is for Laura Patone. Prior to the final vote on the contract, you didn't state a public position on whether paraprofessionals deserved a starting wage increase from $20,000 to $25,000. In the future, are you willing to take a public position on important issues, and what else will you do differently to be more transparent with your constituents?
So in the context of the contract, I work really hard to understand all the different perspectives and work hard to kind of create the whole package about what we're all looking for, what's going to benefit our students, and what is going to meet the interests of educators and also be fiscally responsible. We've got to balance all these different factors at once. To say that I'm going to support one individual item without necessarily looking at everything else feels to me somewhat irresponsible, and that I have to balance all these different factors. I'll do my best to communicate. You know, I said very clearly that I was interested in improving wages for our paraprofessionals. I wasn't necessarily saying specifically how to do it, but that was something that was important to me, and I have never been inconsistent about that. So to be clear, I'm interested in sharing, but I also want to do a good job of being fiscally responsible and making sure that I balance both understanding the needs and the desires of everyone in our community. And that's one of the reasons clearly for me that I'm interested in interest-based bargaining, because I really want to put all the factors on the table. It's really, really hard to just fold one item up and say, this is what we want, without considering everything else, because the bottom line is what is going to be in the best interest of our students.
Thank you. And this last question is for Scott Benjamin. You stated in your questionnaire that you are supportive of the STEPS program because it would benefit some children. During the school committee meeting on May 3rd, it was revealed that the STEPS program has no specific curriculum or concrete articulated goals beyond general mentorship. In light of this, please tell us more about why you support the STEPS program.
First, I didn't say I support the STEPS program. I said that I have support sometimes programs like STEPS because I have seen things like that work. Our particular STEPS program, I actually don't support, because I think it is, you know, in my previous answers, I mentioned the populations of kids that we have that are they're just not comfortable with police, and even, you know, like some of our STEPS officers are from Mystic and know the kids and are from that population, and I understand some people are comfortable with it, but some are not. So if my answer led to believing that I support the STEPS program, I actually don't think it's good. It's appropriate. But what I'm saying is that I have seen programs like that bring some benefit to students, but overall, I don't think that they do overall have a benefit for our students.
Thank you, Scott. That's our final question of the evening. Thanks to all the candidates for joining us tonight, and thanks to everyone watching for your engagement with the important issues that face our city. As a reminder, folks can find each of the candidates' questionnaire responses on the endorsements and elections section of our website, ourrevolutionsomerville.org. Our next forum will be held on Friday night at 7 p.m. with a candidate seeking ORS's endorsement in their run for Ward City Councilor. Until then, good night. Thank you all.